The Mojave Desert does not forgive weakness. It does not forgive the small animal caught too far from its den when the sun goes down. It does not forgive the traveler who underestimates the distance between water sources. And it does not forgive the man who bleeds too slowly to notice he is dying. On the night of October 14th, 1998, the desert outside Kingman, Arizona, was doing what it always did after dark, pulling the heat back up into the sky and replacing it with a cold so dry and absolute it felt like breathing glass. The wind came in hard off the Wallapai Mountains, pushing curtains of fine red dust across Highway 93, rattling the brittle branches of the creosote bushes, moaning through the gaps in the old wooden fence posts that lined the edge of Ruth Perkins' property. Ruth Perkins ran what the state of Arizona officially classified as a licensed foster care home. 6 children, one crumbling 2-story house set back a quarter-mile from the highway on a dirt access road that turned to mud soup every time it rained and cracked into a moonscape when it dried. The state of Arizona sent Ruth a check every month for each child in her care. The state of Arizona did not send anyone to watch what happened to those children between inspections. What happened was this: the children learned to be invisible. 8-year-old Wren Calloway had learned faster than most. She was small for her age, the kind of small that made social workers write words like undernourished in their notebooks, and then close the notebooks and drive back to their offices in Kingman. She had pale blonde hair that hadn't been properly washed in 2 weeks, wide gray eyes that took in everything and gave back nothing, and a set of ribs that pressed visibly against the fabric of her nightgown when she breathed. She had been in the foster system for 3 years, since the night a Mojave County Sheriff's deputy had found her sitting alone on the steps of a gas station in Dolan Springs, holding a paper bag containing everything she owned. One change of clothes, a broken plastic comb, and a photograph of a woman she was already starting to forget. 3 years in the system had taught Wren several things. It had taught her that adults made promises they did not keep. It had taught her that crying made things worse, not better. It had taught her that the best way to survive any given day was to make herself so small, so quiet, so utterly unremarkable that the dangerous people around her simply forgot she existed. And it had taught her that the old horse barn at the far edge of Ruth's property, sagging half-collapsed, smelling permanently of old hay and dry rot, was the safest place on the entire 2 acres. Ruth Perkins did not go to the barn. Ruth Perkins did not like to walk farther than the distance between her kitchen table and her television set. She was a heavy-set woman in her mid-50s with iron gray hair and eyes the color of old dishwater, and she ran her household the way a prison warden runs a cell block, with absolute authority, minimal investment, and a complete indifference to the inner lives of the people under her care. She had been fostering children for 11 years. She had learned that the state paid the same monthly stipend regardless of whether you served the children hot meals or cold cereal, regardless of whether you spoke to them with kindness or contempt, regardless of whether they were warm enough at night or shivered under thin blankets while the desert wind found every crack in the old house's walls. Ruth had made her calculations accordingly. The barn was Wren's, or at least it felt that way in the deep private way that children claim spaces the adults around them have stopped caring about. She had arranged a nest for herself in the northeast corner, a wooden crate turned on its side, 3 horse blankets of varying degrees of cleanliness stacked on a pile of old hay bales, a rusted coffee can she used as a lantern holder for the stub of candles she'd found in the kitchen junk drawer. On the rough wooden wall beside her nest, she had tacked up a single page torn from an old encyclopedia she'd found in a box of donated books, a detailed anatomical diagram of the human circulatory system, with all the major vessels labeled in tiny print. Wren had found the diagram 6 months ago and had studied it the way other children studied baseball cards. She was not sure why the human body fascinated her the way it did. Maybe it was because the body was honest in a way that people were not. The body had rules. The heart pumped blood in, pumped blood out. The lungs pulled air in, pushed air out. Everything followed a logical sequence, and if you understood the sequence, you understood what was wrong, and sometimes you understood what to do about it. She had also found in that same donated box a battered copy of a Red Cross first aid manual from 1987. She had read it cover to cover 4 times. She had read it the way some children read adventure stories, not because someone told her to, but because the information inside it felt like something she might one day need in a way she couldn't yet name. She was not a strange child. She was a child who had learned to find comfort in things she could understand and control because everything else in her life was neither. It was past midnight. The other 5 children in Ruth's house were asleep. Ruth herself had been asleep since 10. Her bedroom door shut, the blue flicker of the television she left on, all night visible in the gap beneath the door. Wren had slipped out of the house 2 hours earlier, moving through the dark hallway, with the practiced silence of long habit easing the back door open with both hands so the hinges wouldn't creak. Crossing the yard barefoot because her only pair of shoes was 2 sizes too big and made more noise than bare feet on gravel. She was sitting in her barn nest, the candle stub burning low, studying the circulatory diagram for what was probably the 40th time tracing with her fingertip the vessels that branched along the right side of the torso when the highway came alive. She heard it before she saw it, a sound so large it seemed to come from inside the earth rather than from the surface of it. The deep, gut-level percussion of a motorcycle engine running at the absolute limit of what its frame could sustain. Not the casual rumble of a Sunday rider. This was a machine being pushed past reason, the engine note cracking and stuttering at the top of its range, the exhaust sound swinging wildly as whoever was riding fought to keep the bike on the road. Wren set down her diagram. She went to the gap in the barn's east wall, a 6-inch split in the old boards that gave her a clear line of sight to the highway, and she looked out. One headlight where there should have been 2. The surviving beam swept wild arcs across the desert scrub as the bike swayed on the road, the rider's weight shifting desperately. Even from a quarter-mile away, Wren could see that something was catastrophically wrong, not with the machine but with the person on it. The riding was not controlled, it was desperate. It was the riding of someone trying to stay upright through sheer will when their body was no longer capable of cooperating. The headlight swung hard left. The bike left the highway. It crossed the gravel shoulder in a spray of loose rock, hit the dirt access road at an angle that was all wrong and went airborne for a half-second before the front wheel caught and the whole machine twisted sideways. The sound that followed was not a crash exactly. It was a long, grinding shriek of chrome on gravel, a deep, hollow boom, as something heavy struck the wooden fence post at the edge of Ruth's property. And then a silence so complete and sudden that it felt like a physical pressure against Wren's eardrums. She did not move for 30 seconds. Every instinct she had in 3 years in the foster system had sharpened those instincts to a very fine edge, told her to stay exactly where she was. Loud noises in the dark were not Wren Calloway's problem. Wren Calloway's problem was staying invisible until morning, when Ruth woke up and the dangerous hours of unsupervised night became the merely unpleasant hours of supervised day. Then the groan came. It was low and rough, and it didn't sound like a person at first. It sounded like a large animal, something with significant mass and significant pain, and it came from the direction of the ditch that ran along the inside of the fence line. It came once, then stopped, then came again, weaker with a wet quality underneath it, that Wren's first aid manual had a specific word for labored. She picked up the candle stub. She set it down again. A lit candle was visible from the highway, and Wren had learned to think about these things. She went to the barn door, eased it open, 6 inches, slipped through, and moved toward the ditch. The moon was 3/4 full, and the desert sky held it up like a spotlight. In that cold white light, as her eyes adjusted, the wreckage came into focus. The motorcycle was a massive custom machine, a Harley-Davidson chopper with extended forks and a fuel tank painted deep red, and it was destroyed. The front end was accordioned into the base of the fence post. One handlebar had sheared off entirely. The chrome was peeled back in long, bright strips, like the skin of something that had been torn open. The rear wheel was still spinning slowly, clicking against a broken spoke, with a sound like a metronome counting down. The man lay 6 feet from the bike. Wren stopped walking. She had seen big men before. She had not seen a man this large outside of a television set. He was easily 6'3", built in the way that suggested not a gym, but decades of physical labor and a life lived in conditions that burned everything soft away. He was wearing heavy dark denim jeans, boots with steel caps, and a leather vest over a flannel shirt. And on the back of the vest, even in the moonlight, even at this distance, the insignia was unmistakable. The winged skull. The top rocker that read Hell's Angels in white block letters on black. The bottom rocker, Kingman. Ren stood in the desert dark and looked at this man for a long moment. She knew what Hell's Angels were. Ruth had been very clear about this on the one occasion a pair of riders had stopped for gas at the station visible from the end of the access road. Ruth had pulled the kitchen curtain shut with the finality of someone lowering a blast shield and had said in the flat voice she used for statements she considered self-evident. Those men are dangerous, and you don't look at them, and you don't speak to them, and if one ever comes to this door, you go straight to your room and you lock it. Ren had filed this information away without comment. Now she looked at the man on the ground, and she saw the blood. It was black in the moonlight. Blood always looked black at night, she knew this from her manual. But the quantity of it was what registered first, the way it had soaked through his flannel shirt on the right side and spread outward in a pattern that was still expanding, still moving the edges of it, finding new paths through the dirt and gravel with every shallow rise and fall of his chest. He was alive. He was also at the rate he was losing blood, operating on a timeline that was not measured in hours. Ren Calloway stood in the cold Arizona desert in her bare feet and her thin nightgown, and she thought about what her manual said about arterial hemorrhage. She thought about the diagram on the barn wall. She thought about the vessels that ran along the right side of the torso and what happened when they were compromised, and how much time a person had before the compromise became irreversible. Then she made a decision. She turned and ran back to the house. She went in through the kitchen window. Ruth locked the back door from the inside at 9 o'clock every night, but the kitchen window latch had been broken since August, and Ruth had not bothered to fix it. Ren had been using it as a secondary exit for 3 months. She hooked her fingers under the aluminum frame, pulled it up, put one knee on the sill, and was inside in 4 seconds. The house was silent except for the television murmur behind Ruth's closed door. Ren moved down the hall to the bathroom. She opened the medicine cabinet. She took stock with the rapid, categorical efficiency of someone who had spent months reading about exactly this kind of situation. Hydrogen peroxide. 2 full bottles. She took both. Medical tape. 1 partial roll. She took it. Gauze. A single roll partially used. She took it. From the narrow linen closet beside the bathroom, she took 3 white hand towels, the good ones Ruth kept for herself and never let the children touch. From the kitchen junk drawer, she took the scissors, the real scissors with the orange handles, not the child safety scissors, with the plastic blade that couldn't cut wet paper. She bundled everything into one of the towels, tied the corners, went back to the kitchen window, and was outside again in under 4 minutes. She ran back across the dark yard through the gap in the fence and knelt in the dirt beside the man who was bleeding to death. Up close, he was even larger. His chest, even in its shallow, irregular rise and fall, had the dimensions of something architectural. His hands, one of which was pressed weakly against his right side, in the involuntary pressure response of a body trying to stop what was happening to it, were enormous, scarred across the knuckles, tattooed across the backs, the fingers thick as broom handles. His face, turned partially to the side, was weathered in the way of men who spent decades outdoors, deep lines around the eyes and mouth, a jaw covered in several days of dark beard going gray at the edges. He looked even unconscious and bleeding in the dirt, like a man who had never in his adult life been afraid of anything. Ren set her bundle down. She untied the towel and laid everything out in order: peroxide, gauze, tape, scissors. The 2 remaining towels folded flat. She was not hurrying. Hurrying caused mistakes. Deliberate sequential action was what the manual described, and so deliberate sequential action was what she performed. She needed to see the wound. She reached for the scissors and began to cut the flannel shirt away from his right side, working from the hem upward, moving carefully around his hand. The fabric was saturated and heavy. When she peeled it back, she saw them 2 entry wounds close together, slightly below the bottom rib on his right side. The surrounding tissue was already swelling and darkening. The bleeding from the lower wound was slower and surface level. The bleeding from the upper wound was not. Her first aid manual had a section on hemorrhage control. She had read it so many times she could have recited it from memory in her sleep. Direct pressure. Sustained firm direct pressure on the wound. Do not remove the dressing to check the wound every time you lift it. You disturb the clotting process and restart the bleeding. She folded one towel into a tight square. She positioned it directly over both wounds. She placed both of her small hands on top of it and she pressed down as hard as she could. The man's eyes snapped open. They were very dark brown, so deep they were nearly black in the moonlight. And they went from unconscious to fully alert in the time it takes a light switch to close a circuit. It was not a gradual waking. It was the instantaneous threat response of a man who had spent a significant portion of his life in situations where the difference between a second's hesitation and immediate action was the difference between living and not. His right hand came up and locked around Ren's left wrist with a force that made the bones in her hand creak against each other. Ren did not pull back. She did not cry out. She had felt worse grip than this from Ruth's hand when Ruth was in a certain kind of mood, and she had learned that flinching invited more pressure. She kept both hands flat on the towel, and she looked directly into the dark eyes that were scanning her with the desperate, rapid focus of a man trying to understand a situation that made no sense to him. "You're leaking," Ren said. Her voice was quiet and completely level. "I've got my hands on it. Don't move." The man stared at her. His grip on her wrist did not tighten further, but it did not release either. "Kid." His voice came out like gravel in a metal drum. Low, rough, each word costing him something measurable. "You need to go, right now. People coming." "I know," Ren said. "I heard the highway. How long ago?" He blinked. The question had not been what he expected. "What? How long ago did you leave the highway, the people following you? How long since they last saw you?" He seemed to be recalibrating his understanding of the conversation, of what kind of child this was and what kind of conversation this was going to be. 10 minutes, maybe 15. "Then I have time," Ren said. "Hold this." She lifted one of her hands from the towel and guided his free hand, the one not wrapped around her wrist, to the compress. "Press down, as hard as you can stand. Don't lift it. Don't look at it. Just press." He pressed. He let go of her wrist. Ren picked up the first bottle of hydrogen peroxide. "This is going to hurt," she said, not unkindly. She had read about this too. Inform the patient before you cause pain so the pain doesn't become panic. It's going to feel like fire and you're going to want to move. Don't move. She lifted the edge of the compress just enough to get the bottle's opening close to the upper wound and poured. The man's response was extraordinary in its discipline. His entire body went rigid, every muscle in his massive frame contracting simultaneously like a power surge running through an electrical grid, and the sound that came out of him was not a scream. It was a single compressed syllable that started somewhere deep in his chest and came out through his teeth, which were clamped so hard together she could hear the enamel grinding. His free hand went into the dirt beside him, and his fingers dug 4 furrows into the earth like a plow breaking hardpan. Then he went still again, rigid with pain but still. Ren pressed the compress back down hard. She began to wrap gauze around his torso, passing the roll under his body and back up 3 times, 4 times, pulling it as tight as her arms could manage, which was tighter than a grown adult might have expected from a girl who weighed 63 pounds. She finished the wrap and used most of the medical tape to anchor its strips across the gauze, anchored to the skin above and below the wound site, exactly the way the manual diagram showed. She sat back on her heels and looked at her work. The compress was holding. The bleeding had not stopped. She didn't expect it to stop completely. Not from wounds like these, but it had slowed significantly. She could see the difference in the rate at which the towel was darkening. The color change was slower now. That was what she had been trying to achieve. She looked at the man's face. He was watching her. The pain was still there. It lived in the tight lines around his eyes, in the shallow, careful way he was breathing. But the wild threat response had settled into something else. He was looking at her the way you look at something that doesn't fit any category you've previously established. and you are trying to decide which category to build for it. What's your name? He asked. Wren. A pause. Like the bird. Yes. He seemed to consider this for a moment. How old are you, Wren? 8. Another pause longer. He looked up at the desert sky briefly at the stars, which were extraordinary out here, away from the city lights, as if he was having a private consultation with whatever he believed in. Then he looked back at her. Where'd you learn to do that? Book, she said. Red Cross, First Aid Manual, 1987 edition. You read first aid manuals. I read everything, Wren said simply. There's not much else to do here. She began cleaning up the wrappings from the gauze roll, the empty peroxide bottle, tucking everything back into the remaining towel. She was already thinking about disposal. She'd need to bury the bloody materials before Ruth woke up, which meant she needed a spot where Ruth would never walk, which meant behind the old water tank on the far side of the barn. Soft soil there, easy to dig with a flat rock. The man was still watching her. His breathing had regularized slightly, still shallow, still careful, but the liquid rattling quality had smoothed out a fraction. That was the pressure working. You live here, he said. Not a question. Yes. Alone, just you. 6 of us. And Ruth. She paused. She's the one who runs the place. Something shifted in his expression, not in an obvious way, in the way that a landscape shifts when a cloud passes over the sun, the same features, different quality of light. Ruth, she your family? No, Wren said. She said it the way she said most things, flatly, without color, because color cost something she had learned not to spend on things she couldn't change. He was quiet for a moment. Then, who did that? Wren looked up. He was looking at her collarbone, at the neckline of her nightgown, which had slipped to one side in all the movement and the kneeling and the reaching. She looked down at what he was looking at and reached up and pulled the fabric back into place without expression. I fell, she said. The man looked at her for a long moment. His dark eyes were very steady for a man who had lost as much blood as he had. That a regular thing, he said quietly. Falling. Wren didn't answer. She folded the clean towel into her bundle and tied the corners. You need to go, she said, before those people get here. There's a payphone at the Chevron station on 93 about half a mile south. I've seen it from the road. He didn't move immediately. He was still looking at her with that expression, the one that had no clean name, something large and tangled occupying the same space behind his eyes. You said Ruth, he said. She the one who fell you. It was not a question this time. It was a statement delivered in the flat register of someone who has arrived at a conclusion and is simply registering it aloud. Wren looked at him steadily. If you don't start moving in the next few minutes, you're going to lose enough blood that moving won't be an option. The pressure dressing I put on will hold for a few hours if you don't tear it. You need to call your people, and you need to not be here when those men come back to look for you along the highway. A very long silence settled between them, filled only by the wind in the creosote and the distant sound of a long-haul truck somewhere on the highway. Then slowly, with the monumental effort of a man overriding his body's most fundamental objections, he began to push himself up. The effort it cost him was visible in every part of him, the way the cords stood out in his neck, the way the breath came in and out through his clenched teeth, the way his massive frame shook slightly with the sustained demand of it. She put her shoulder under his arm without being asked, bracing against his weight, which was roughly 4 times hers. And he made it to one knee, then to both feet. He stood there in the moonlight, breathing, one hand pressed flat against the bandaged side. He was extraordinarily tall. Standing directly beside him, the top of Wren's head reached his lowest rib. He reached into his leather vest, the inside pocket, the hidden one with the snap closure. He pulled out something on a chain. She heard the metal slide and clink before she saw it in the moonlight. A medallion, solid silver, roughly the size of a silver dollar, but heavier, the kind of weight that meant something. On the face of it, the winged skull of the Hells Angels Charter. On the back, an embossed design she couldn't make out clearly in the dark. He held it out to her. She looked at it, then at him. Take it, he said. Keep it hidden. Don't show it to anyone in that house." She took it. The silver was warm from being against his body, warmer than the desert air around them, and holding it felt like holding something that had recently been alive. He reached into a different pocket and came out with a small folding knife, the kind with a single short blade used for utility work, worn smooth from long use. He opened it, turned the medallion over in his palm, and in 4 quick strokes, careful, deliberate, barely needing to look, he carved something into the inner edge of the silver rim. She couldn't see what in the darkness. She heard the scrape of metal on metal, 4 distinct movements, and then he folded the knife and put it away. "There's a mark on the inside edge now," he said. "Charter mark. Only people who belong to this brotherhood know what it means." He looked at her directly, and even in the poor light, even pale from blood loss, his gaze had a weight that she felt physically. "You ever need help, real help, not the kind that comes with a clipboard and a form to fill out, you find a man wearing what I'm wearing." He reached back and touched the patch on his vest. "You show him that mark on the inside edge. He'll know what it means, and he'll know what to do. You understand me?" Ren curled her fingers around the medallion. "What's your name?" she asked. "Beckett," he said. "Brothers call me Grizzly." She looked at him for a moment. "Does it hurt?" she asked. Not the wound she knew. The wound hurt, she had watched it hurt him. She meant the standing, the breathing, the quarter-mile between here and the payphone. "Yeah," he said. The word came out simple and undecorated. "It does. You need to go anyway." "I know." He looked at her for a moment more. Something moved through his expression that had no clean name, something large and tangled, occupying the same space. And then he said very quietly, almost as though he was saying it to the desert rather than to her, "Nobody should fall that much, little bird. Nobody that small." Ren did not respond to this. She had learned through long practice that some statements were not invitations to conversation, but simply things that needed to be said aloud and acknowledged by a witness. The only respectful answer was to receive them in silence. He turned and moved into the desert dark, heading south along the fence line toward the highway. He moved slowly, one hand pressed against his bandaged side, his body tilted slightly against the pain. But he moved. She stood in the dirt and watched him until the darkness absorbed him, until the shape of him blurred into the creosote scrub and the shadow of the fence line, and was simply gone. Then she went to work. She carried the bloody bundle, the towels, the empty peroxide bottles, the gauze wrappings around the back of the barn to the space behind the old water tank. She used a flat rock to dig a hole in the soft desert soil, placed the bundle inside covered. It smoothed the surface as best she could with her palm, and scattered a handful of loose dirt and dry creosote leaves over the area. It would not survive a thorough search. It would survive a casual glance, which was the only kind of search she could reasonably expect Ruth to conduct. She went back to the barn. She picked up the circulatory diagram from the hay bale where she'd left it, and held it close to the almost dead candle stub. She looked at the artery diagrams on the right side of the torso, traced with her finger the vessels she'd been trying to reach, with the compress estimating in the careful, methodical way she estimated everything, whether she had positioned the pressure point correctly. She believed she had. She believed the pressure was where it needed to be. The slowing she had observed in the rate of blood saturation through the towel supported this belief. She would not know for certain until she found out whether he made it to that payphone. She pressed the silver medallion flat against the diagram and looked at it in the candlelight. On the inner rim where Beckett Holt had put the knife to the metal, she could now make out the mark he'd carved, the letter B, small and precise, cut into the silver, with the confidence of a man who had done this before and knew exactly what he was making. She didn't know what it meant within the charter. She knew it meant something, and she knew it was meant specifically for her, and she knew she needed to keep it hidden, and so she tied the chain around her neck and tucked the medallion beneath the neckline of her nightgown, where it rested cool at first, and then warm against the skin over her sternum. She sat in the hay until the candle burned down to nothing. She sat in the dark, and she thought about the man moving south through the desert with 2 bullet holes in his side and a pressure dressing she'd built from stolen materials. She thought about the men he said were coming. She thought about the wrecked motorcycle visible from the highway, and the tire marks leaving the road, and the trail of disrupted earth leading to the fence post, and what a careful person following that trail would find. She thought about the bloody materials buried behind the water tank. She thought about the look on Beckett Holt's face when he had said the word falling, and the particular quality of his silence after she hadn't answered him. At 6:53 in the morning, the sun came up over the Hualapai Mountains and painted the desert floor the color of old copper. At precisely 7 o'clock, the sound of Ruth Perkins' heavy footsteps crossed the upstairs floor and moved toward the bathroom, and Wren, who was lying in her bed in the small room she shared with two other girls, listened to those footsteps the way you listen to weather. She was lying on her back with her eyes open and her hands folded over the medallion beneath her nightgown, and she was not sleeping, and she was not afraid exactly, but she was very, very still. The footsteps stopped. The pause that followed had a particular quality, the silence of someone standing in front of an open medicine cabinet, conducting an inventory of what they expect to see against what they are actually seeing. Then the scream. It came through the walls and the floor and the thin plaster ceiling of Wren's room like something with physical mass. Ruth's voice at its absolute highest register, a sound like a length of sheet metal being torn. Wren heard it, and she closed her eyes, and she breathed in for 4 counts out. For 4 counts, the way the manual said to breathe when you needed your hands to stay steady and your mind to stay clear. The footsteps came down the stairs, down the hallway, hit the door of Wren's room with enough force to bounce it off the wall and leave a dent in the plaster. Ruth Perkins stood in the doorway with an empty roll of medical tape in one hand and a face the color of something that had been left too long on a stove. Behind her in the hallway, the other children had materialized in their doorways, silent and wide-eyed, doing the thing they had all learned to do when Ruth reached this particular temperature, making themselves part of the wall. Wren sat up. Ruth crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed Wren by the arm, hauling her out of the bed with the casual, practiced strength of a woman who had been doing exactly this for years. The grip landed on the same wrist Beckett Holt had grabbed in the dark, and the pressure was different, angrier, less aware of itself. And Wren went with it because she had learned long ago that going with it hurt less than resisting. "You little thief," Ruth said. Her voice had dropped from the scream into something worse, the flat, cold register she used when she had moved past anger into something more calculated. "My towels, my peroxide, my tape." Each word received its own separate weight. "What did you take them for?" "I fell," Wren said. "I cut my knee in the yard. I cleaned it up." Ruth looked at her with the expression of a woman performing a rapid calculation, whether the lie was worth the effort of disproving, or whether it was faster and more satisfying to simply punish the behavior and move on. Ruth decided on the second option. She always did. She dragged Wren by the arm down the hallway, past the silent watching children who pressed themselves against the walls as they passed past the bathroom with its ransacked medicine cabinet to the door at the far end of the hall. This door had a deadbolt on the outside. It was the only door in the house that locked from the wrong side, and Ruth had installed it herself 4 years ago. And the state inspector who had noted it during the last visit had accepted Ruth's explanation that it was a storage room. Ruth threw the bolt open with one hand while she held Wren's arm with the other. Beyond the door, wooden stairs dropped into darkness. The basement of Ruth Perkins' house was not used for storage. Ruth released her arm and shoved not violently, but with the flat efficiency of someone disposing of something, and Wren went down the first 2 steps before she caught the railing and stopped herself. The door slammed behind her. The bolt slid home with a sound that was very final. Darkness. Complete, absolute windowless darkness, the kind that makes no distinction between open eyes and closed eyes. Wren stood on the second stair and breathed. In, out, in, out. She sat down on the stair and put her back against the wall and brought her knees up to her chest. She reached beneath the neckline of her nightgown and pulled out the medallion on its chain, wrapping both hands around it. The silver was still warm from her skin. She could not see it in the dark, but she could feel the shape of it. The raised edges of the winged skull on the face, the ridged border around the circumference, and on the inner edge, small and precise, and cut by a man who had been doing her the particular honor of taking her seriously, the letter B. Outside on the desert highway a quarter mile away, The morning traffic was beginning the slow, heavy rumble of long-haul trucks heading north toward Las Vegas. The occasional pickup truck, the ordinary sounds of an ordinary Thursday morning in Kingman, Arizona, none of which had any idea that anything had happened in the night. And somewhere in the desert, moving in some direction, Wren couldn't know where the men Beckett Holt had warned her about. She had heard him leave. She had not heard a payphone call. She did not know whether he had made it or whether he had fallen somewhere between the fence and the highway, whether the pressure dressing she had built from stolen towels and a half-used roll of gauze had held through the walk. She did not know yet that 40 miles south in the industrial district on the edge of Kingman proper, a telephone was already ringing in a concrete building behind a razor wire fence. She did not know yet that someone had answered it. She sat in the dark with the medallion in her hands, and she waited because waiting was something Wren Calloway knew how to do better than almost anything else in the world. She had been waiting her entire life for something to change, for someone to notice, for the distance between where she was and somewhere better to close by, even a small amount. What she did not know, what she could not have known, was that the waiting was almost over. The Hells Angels clubhouse in Kingman sat on a dead-end industrial street between a salvage yard and a concrete mixing plant, and it looked exactly like what it was, a building designed from the foundation up to keep people out. Cinder block walls 2 courses thick, a roof reinforced with welded steel plate, every window bricked over from the inside. The only entrance was a set of heavy metal doors wide enough to roll a motorcycle through. And those doors were controlled from the inside by a man who knew every member of the charter by face and by voice, and who did not open them for anyone he did not recognize. At 3:47 in the morning, those doors were open, and every light in the building was burning. The pool table in the main room had been cleared of everything that normally lived on its green felt surface. The rack of balls, the scattered bottles, the rolling papers and poker chips, and the dog-eared deck of cards that had been in play since Tuesday. And in their place lay Beckett Holt, flat on his back, his massive frame extending nearly the full length of the table, his leather vest cut away, and discarded his flannel shirt in pieces on the concrete floor around him. A battery-powered shop lamp had been rigged above the table, on a length of logging chain, flooding the immediate area in harsh white light that made everything look like the inside of an operating room. Standing over him, his forearms bloody to the elbow, was a man the charter called Stitch. His given name was Thomas Boone, and before he had found his way to the Kingman charter of the Hells Angels, he had served 3 years with the 75th Ranger Regiment as a combat medic, 2 deployments to locations that did not appear in any public military record, and a 3rd deployment that he had never described to anyone in any context under any circumstances. He had treated gunshot wounds in conditions that made a well-lit pool table look like a surgical theater. He had saved men in the dark and the rain and the mud with his hands and a kit the size of a paperback novel, and he had lost men he should have saved. And both sets of experiences had made him the kind of medic who worked in complete silence and moved with an economy of motion that looked almost bored to anyone who didn't know what they were watching. His hands were not bored. His hands were doing 3 things at once. "Get him up on his side," Stitch said without looking up from what he was doing. 30 degrees, just 30. 2 men materialized from the edge of the room and adjusted Beckett's position with a practiced efficiency that suggested the charter had been through versions of this before, not often, but often enough to know the choreography. Pressure on the primary compress. Don't lift it. A 3rd set of hands came in and replaced Stitch's, briefly pressing down on the layered gauze that was now soaked through on its outer layers, but in a way that clearly had Stitch's attention, was not soaked through to the backing. Stitch looked at the compress. He looked at it for several seconds in a way that was not the look of a man assessing a medical situation, but the look of a man examining a piece of work. His head tilted slightly. His eyes moved in the precise pattern of someone checking specific things against a mental list. "Who wrapped this?" he asked. No one in the room answered immediately. "I'm not asking who did it wrong," Stitch said. His voice was completely flat. He still hadn't looked up from the compress. "I'm asking who did it right. This is a field pressure dressing applied under field conditions, and whoever applied it knew what they were doing. The layering is correct. The anchor points are correct. The tension distribution across the wrap is correct. He paused. Someone with training put this on. Who was with you, Beckett? Beckett Holt, who had been conscious for approximately 6 minutes since being carried through the clubhouse doors, conscious in the unsteady, fragmented way of a man who was running on what remained of his blood volume, after a significant portion of it had been left in a ditch off Highway 93, opened his eyes. They were not entirely focused, but behind the unfocused there was something determined. The look of a man who has decided he has things to say and intends to say them before any other outcome becomes possible. Kid, he said. Stitch waited. Little girl, 8 years old. Beckett stopped, breathed, managed the breath. She was in a barn, off Highway 93, Ruth Perkins' place, about a quarter mile from the highway. Another breath. She had a first aid manual. Red Cross. She'd read it. She actually sat down and read the whole thing. The silence that fell over the room after this had a specific texture to it. It was the silence of a room full of large men who have encountered a piece of information that does not belong in any category they have previously established, and who are in the process of building a new one. Stitch looked at the compress one more time. Then he picked up his forceps. Hold him, he said quietly. Standing against the far wall, arms crossed over his chest, both boots planted on the concrete floor, in the particular way of a man who has not voluntarily sat down in the presence of a problem since sometime in the previous decade, was Decker Pruitt. He was 61 years old, and he looked like what 40 years of living the way he had lived produced in a man who had survived it. A face that was a record of weather and consequence, and time in the way that a canyon wall is a record of what has moved through it. His hair had gone entirely white sometime in his early 50s, and he had left it that way. He was not the largest man in the room. He was not the loudest. He had not raised his voice a single time since arriving at the clubhouse 45 minutes ago, and in a room full of agitated men who were expressing their agitation at considerable volume, his absolute stillness was the loudest thing in it. He was the president of the Kingman Charter of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club, and he had held that position for 14 years, and in those 14 years the charter had buried 4 brothers and put 11 enemies in positions they found considerably less comfortable than burial, and Decker Pruitt had presided over all of it with the same expression he was wearing right now. The expression of a man who has looked at the worst available information and is already several moves ahead of it in his thinking. Tell me again, he said. His voice was low enough that it didn't carry past the 4 men closest to him. Everything, from the beginning. Slowly. Garrett Whitfield, the charter's vice president, a man assembled on a scale that suggested he had been built for a different era of human conflict, who went by Axel, leaned in from Decker's left. He's not in a condition to be running his mouth, Deck. He's talking, Decker said without looking at Garrett. Let him talk. From the pool table being held in position by 2 men while Stitch worked, Beckett Holt talked. He talked the way a man talks when he understands he may be working with a limited supply of consciousness and needs to spend what he has on the important things. Carefully, sequentially, spending each word like it costs something. He described the ambush on Highway 93, 2 vehicles positioned on a curve with their lights off waiting. He described losing the mirror and the headlight in the first exchange, and understanding immediately that whoever had set this up had done so with professional knowledge of how to disable a motorcycle in motion. He described the ride that followed, or what passed for riding, which was mostly falling in a controlled direction and relying on the machine's momentum to carry him far enough from the ambush site to make pursuit complicated. Then he described Wren, the barn door opening in the dark, the small shape crossing the yard toward him without hesitation, the way she'd laid out her supplies in order before touching him, gauze peroxide tape scissors, the way someone does when they've thought through a procedure before beginning it. The peroxide. His jaw tightened at the memory of the peroxide, and 2 of the men holding him tightened their grip in response. He described the bruise on her collarbone, the way her ribs showed through the fabric of her nightgown, the way she had said, "I fell," in the flat, automatic voice of someone who has said those words so many times they have stopped experiencing them as words at all. He described the medallion, the mark he'd put on it, When he finished, the room was quiet for a duration that had weight to it. Decker Pruitt unfolded his arms and let them hang at his sides, a small physical adjustment that the men who had ridden with him for years recognized as the external sign of a decision moving from consideration into resolution. "Axel," he said. Garrett Whitfield straightened. "Yeah. Pull everything we have access to on Ruth Perkins. Property records, foster, license registration, anything in the county database." A pause. "And get Suit on the phone." Whitmore Vance Charter named Suit, a designation that had begun as a joke about the Italian wool blazers he favored and had become simply the most accurate word for him, was the Kingman Charter's legal infrastructure. He maintained a legitimate law practice on Beale Street downtown, handling the kinds of matters that generated legitimate billable hours, and he also handled the considerably less formally categorized legal requirements of 47 members of the Hells Angels Motorcycle Club. And he had never in 11 years of doing both confused the two categories or allowed them to contaminate each other. He answered the phone on the second ring, which meant he was already awake, which meant Decker was not the only person tonight who had needed him. "Already running it," Vance said when Decker explained what he wanted. "I heard Beckett came in. I'm pulling the property records now and cross-referencing against the county foster care registry." "I need prior CPS involvement," Decker said. "Every report, every outcome. I need to know what the state knew and when they knew it." 20 minutes. 10. He ended the call and looked across the room at Stitch. "When can he move?" Stitch didn't look up. "Define the movement." "Ride." A pause during which Stitch made two precise movements with his forceps. "Tomorrow morning early if nothing goes wrong tonight. Tonight if he decides to do something that would require him to be significantly stupider than I know him to be." Decker nodded once. He walked to the metal doors of the clubhouse, put his shoulder against one and pushed it open far enough to step through. Outside, the desert night was cold and entirely still, smelling of creosote and the exhaust residue of 47 motorcycles. To the north, the lights of Kingman proper lay against the underbelly of the cloud cover like a diffuse orange glow. To the south, Highway 93 was a straight line of darkness in the moonlight, empty in both directions. He stood there for a while. He was thinking about a child in a barn at midnight with a first aid manual, pressing her hands flat against a wound she had no professional training to treat, doing it correctly anyway. He was thinking about what Beckett had said about the bruise on her collarbone and about the way she had delivered the words, "I fell." He was thinking about a basement door with a bolt on the outside. Decker Pruitt's code was not the Arizona state code. It was not the federal code. There were lawyers who would have argued, some of them with merit, that it was not any recognizable legal code at all. But it was rigidly consistent. It had governed everything he'd done for 40 years. And at its foundation, beneath everything else, was a principle so simple it barely needed to be stated: you do not put your hands on children. He went back inside. "Mount up at first light," he said to Garrett loudly enough for the room. "Every man who can ride." 20 miles north of the clubhouse on the dirt access road off Highway 93, a pair of headlights moved slowly across the desert floor. The vehicle was a black Suburban with its plates obscured behind a coat of desert dust that looked deliberate, and it moved with the patient deliberation of people who believed they had enough time to be thorough. There were 3 men inside. The man in the front passenger seat was named Harlan Briggs. Briggs was 44 years old, former private military contractor, currently retained by a criminal syndicate that operated its primary businesses out of Nevada while maintaining significant interests in the transportation corridors running through northwestern Arizona. He was not a physically imposing man, medium height, medium build, the kind of face that registered as background in any room he entered. This was professionally useful. What was not medium about Briggs was the quality of his attention. He assessed everything with the same focused, unhurried thoroughness, and what he filed away, he filed accurately and completely, and he did not reach conclusions until he had sufficient information to support them. He had found the wrecked Harley at the fence line 17 minutes ago. He had stood beside it with his small flashlight for a long time, reading the scene, the way he had been trained to read scenes not as a collection of objects, but as a sequence of events recorded in the physical world. The impact point against the fence post told him the bike had left the highway at speed and had not been steered into the property deliberately. The drag marks in the soft dirt, not the random disturbance of a crash site, but the purposeful pattern of a man who had regained enough function to get himself upright and move in a chosen direction, told him the rider had survived the crash. The direction was south toward the highway, but there was something else. Briggs crouched and played the flashlight beam across the area around the crash site at a low angle, the way you do when you want the light to catch impressions rather than surfaces. The beam found what he was looking for near the base of the fence post, a partial print, small, round-toed, the kind made by a bare human foot. He followed it with the beam, found another. Found the place where someone had knelt, two depressions in the dirt, the size and depth consistent with a child's knees, positioned alongside where the rider had been lying. Briggs stood up. He looked at the farmhouse, one upstairs light burning the rest of the structure dark. He looked at the barn. He looked at the faint trails connecting crash site to barn and barn to house and back again, visible to someone who knew how to read them. "Someone helped him," he said. The driver looked at him without speaking. "Someone from that house," Briggs said. "Small. A child, probably." He clicked off the flashlight. "Go knock on the door." Inside the basement of Ruth Perkins' house, Wren Calloway had no way of measuring how much time had passed. This was the specific cruelty of the basement. It was designed, whether intentionally or not, to eliminate time as a concept. No light source, no window, no sound that carried reliably through the concrete and the joists above, except the heaviest footsteps and the most elevated voices. You existed in the dark, and time became a sensation rather than something you could measure, and the sensation was not one that had a positive name. Wren had been in the basement before. 3 times across the 11 months she had been at Ruth's house. She knew its dimensions, roughly 15 by 20 feet, concrete floor, concrete walls, a water heater in the far corner that produced a faint and intermittent warmth. She knew where the slightly loose concrete block was near the bottom of the east wall, the one she had worked incrementally looser on each previous visit, not with any specific plan. But because it was something she could do in the dark, and doing something was better than doing nothing. She was sitting with her back against that block now, her knees drawn up, both hands wrapped around the medallion. She was not doing anything with it, not turning it over, not tracing the carved letter, just holding it. The way you hold something in absolute darkness, not because it helps you see, but because it confirms that solid things exist and that you are among them. She heard the knock at the front door. Not Ruth's knock. Ruth did not knock on doors inside her own house. She simply opened them because they were hers. This knock came from outside, heavy and deliberate, placed with the unhurried confidence of someone who expected the door to be opened. She heard Ruth's footsteps cross the floor overhead, slower than their usual pace, which meant Ruth had been asleep and had been woken. She heard the muffled negotiation of voices, Ruth's voice climbing slightly, which meant surprise shading toward fear, and under it a lower voice, very even, speaking over whatever Ruth was trying to say. Then Ruth's voice again, in a single word that came through the floor, and the joist clearly because it was said louder than everything around it. Basement. Wren's hands tightened on the medallion. She heard footsteps cross the floor above her, more than one person heavier than Ruth. Moving toward the hallway door, she heard the deadbolt slide back. The door opened. A wedge of gray morning light fell down the stairs, and in the center of it, framed against the brightness, was the shape of a man wide in the shoulders, standing completely still, looking down into the dark. Wren did not move. She had learned that not moving was almost always the correct initial response to a new development. You gathered information first. You assessed your options. You moved when you understood what moving could accomplish. "Come up," the man said. His voice was even. Not kind, not threatening. The voice of someone accustomed to giving instructions in the reasonable expectation that they would be followed. Wren looked at the wedge of light. She thought about what she knew Beckett had warned her, that people were coming. These people were here. The question before her was not whether to come up, she understood, with the clarity of a child who had learned early to assess what was and was not negotiable. that this was not a question, but how to come up and what to say and what not to reveal when she did. She tucked the medallion inside her nightgown. She climbed the stairs. Harlan Briggs stood in the hallway of Ruth Perkins' house and looked at the small blonde girl who came up from the basement with an expression on her face that he had not expected. He had worked with enough people in enough difficult situations to have developed a reliable sense of what fear looked like and how it presented, and the girl's expression was not that. It was something controlled and watchful and very specifically calibrated, and it was an expression he had seen before, but not on an 8-year-old face. He noted the bruises on her arm, the ones that looked like grip marks placed where a larger hand had held a smaller wrist. He noted the too large nightgown, the bare feet, the visible structure of ribs. He filed all of it with the neutral efficiency with which he filed everything. And he noted beneath the surface of the composure something that was not simply fear, something that was holding itself very deliberately still for reasons of its own. "You were outside last night," he said. Wren looked at him directly. "I go to the barn sometimes," she said. "I don't sleep well. Did you see anything on the highway?" "I heard a crash," she said. "I went back inside." Briggs studied her. Behind him in the kitchen doorway, Ruth Perkins stood with her arms wrapped around her housecoat, her face working through several expressions at once. The complicated guilt of a woman who has just done something she knew was wrong, layered over the practiced self-justification of someone who is very good at converting her choices into other people's fault. "She's lying." Ruth's voice had the flat certainty of someone who believes they are cutting through complexity. "She stole medical supplies from the bathroom last night. Peroxide, tape, my good towels. She's the one who helped whoever that was." Wren did not look at Ruth. She kept her eyes on Briggs. Briggs kept his eyes on Wren. "Is that right?" he said. Not a question. Wren said nothing. Briggs reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and removed a folded amount of cash without making any particular production of it. He set it on the hallway table without looking at Ruth. Ruth's eyes went to it the way eyes go to sudden light. "The other two outside," Briggs said to the men behind him. To Ruth, "That's for your cooperation and your silence. We both understand what that means." Ruth was already looking at the money. "We're clear," she said. Briggs looked back at Wren. He took one step toward her, and Wren held still. She kept her breathing even, kept her face in the arrangement of a frightened child who was not yet frightened enough to be unmanageable. Because the thing you did not want when someone was trying to assess how much you knew was to look like. You knew enough to be afraid of them specifically. "Where did he go?" Briggs asked. Wren looked at him with her gray eyes wide and level. "I don't know who you're talking about," she said. He crouched down to her eye level, a technique she noted, a deliberate physical adjustment meant to suggest a kind of reasonableness or intimacy. Social workers did it. Police officers did it. She had seen it enough times to recognize the mechanism behind it. He was close enough now that she could smell the cold air still on his jacket, and beneath it something her body recognized before her mind found a name for it. "There was a man," he said. "Large. He'd been riding a motorcycle. He was wearing a leather vest with a patch on the back." "I didn't see anyone," Wren said. He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes were gray, the same color as hers, but where hers held something layered and present, his were flat surfaces that gave back light without absorbing any of it. His hand moved, not toward her sideways, a small gesture to the man nearest him, and before Wren's processing could fully complete the observation, that man had stepped forward and reached past her, his hand going to the front of her nightgown. Wren stepped back. Fast, instinctively, the way you step back from a hand that reaches for something you are protecting. Too fast. She understood immediately that it had been too fast, that the speed of the movement had revealed the fact of the protection. The man reached again, and this time his grip found the chain at her neck and pulled, and the medallion came out from under the fabric and swung free on its chain, the silver catching the hallway light and throwing a small bright arc across the wall. Briggs looked at it. Wren stood still. She understood the calculation now. Reaching for it would confirm its value. She let it go and kept her face arranged. He took the medallion in his fingers carefully, with the attentiveness of someone handling something they believe contains information, and turned it over. He examined the face of it, the winged skull, the charter design. He turned it to examine the edge and looked at the inner rim where the letter B had been cut in 4 strokes in the dark. He didn't know what the mark meant. She could see that he didn't. She watched the brief assessment cross his face, the moment of consideration, the decision that he had extracted what the object could tell him. He closed his fingers around the medallion and lifted the chain over her head. Wren did not reach for it. She kept her face still. Briggs stood up. He put the medallion in the outside pocket of his jacket. He looked at her for a moment in the manner of someone making a final assessment of a variable in a problem they are solving. "Put her back downstairs," he said. And then he turned toward the kitchen and reached for the telephone that hung on the wall beside the refrigerator, and his back was to the hallway. And the man who had taken the medallion was already reaching for Wren's arm, and the second man was moving toward the front of the house. And Ruth was looking at the money on the hallway table, and nobody was positioned well. 3 seconds, perhaps 4. Wren did not deliberate. She had been in smaller versions of this moment before, moments where the geometry of a situation created a window and where thinking about whether to go through it was the thing that closed it. She had learned that in these moments, you identified your direction and you committed to it completely. She went left, past the bathroom, past the laundry room door, to the end of the hallway where the back of the house opened into the mudroom, and the mudroom had a door to the outside with a single sliding bolt on the inside. She had the bolt thrown and the door opened before she heard the first shout from behind her. The desert behind Ruth Perkins' property was not forgiving terrain. It was the Mojave's idea of a backyard loose caliche rock and hardpan and patches of cholla cactus and dry washes that dropped without warning into sandy bottoms. Wren knew this ground. She had walked it in daylight and in dark dozens of times, building a map of it in her head, the way she built maps of everything she might someday need to navigate quickly. She went south. South was the highway. South was away. South was the direction Beckett Holt had gone in the dark the night before. She ran. The caliche cut her feet. She registered the cutting, the sting, the wet heat, and she ran anyway because stopping to assess injuries was a luxury available to people who were not currently being pursued. Her nightgown caught on a branch of dried chaparral, and she tore it free without slowing. The cold morning air entered her lungs in long burning pulls that tasted of dust and creosote. Behind her, the mudroom door hit the exterior wall of the house, and then she heard boots on caliche heavier than her faster per stride, the sound of someone who did not need to be careful about where they put their feet because they were not worried about the caliche. Wren ran harder. She understood the arithmetic of the situation. She was 8 years old and her legs were short. Over distance, the man behind her would close the gap regardless of her head start. What she had that he did not have was knowledge of this particular quarter mile of desert, including the dry wash that cut diagonally across the floor 300 yards south of the house, invisible until you were within 10 feet of the edge. She knew where the crossing was, a point where the wash narrowed and the banks were shallow enough to step down and up in 2 strides. She hit it without slowing and was across and up the other bank and running southwest before the sound of boots behind her faltered and stopped at the edge. She didn't stop. She kept going, angling toward the highway fence line, using the line of mesquite scrub and old fence posts to break her silhouette, moving in the way she had learned to move through spaces where someone might be watching from a vehicle. She ran until the terrain opened and the highway fence appeared ahead of her. She ran until her legs stopped holding her up the way legs are supposed to hold you up, and she went down on her hands and knees in the caliche, both palms taking the impact chest, heaving the cold air coming in and out of her so fast it made her vision swim at the edges. She raised her head. Highway 93 was 20 feet away, empty in both directions except for a truck that was already a mile distant and moving away from her. The sun was low and flat over the Hualapai Mountains, the early light turning the desert floor the color of old bone. She could not go back to the house. She sat with this fact for the time it took to get her breathing back to something functional, and then she set it aside because she had learned that the things you cannot change, you do not spend your resources contemplating. You accept the fact and you move to the question of what you do with it. She thought about what she had. She had the road, she had south, she had feet that were cut and hands that were scraped and a torn nightgown and nothing else. She checked, pressing her hand flat against the front of her nightgown where the medallion had been. Gone. Briggs had it. She set that thought aside too. Not because it didn't matter, it mattered, but because there was a sequence to things, and the medallion was not the first item in the sequence. What she also had stored with the complete and total retention of a child who has learned that any piece of information might eventually be the piece that saves her was what Beckett Holt had said to her in the dark. You ever need help, real help, you find a man wearing what I'm wearing. She had thought in the moment he said it that he meant the medallion was the mechanism. But the medallion was what you showed. The finding was about the vest, the patch, men wearing what he was wearing. She knew bikers existed in Kingman. She had seen them from Ruth's property, small groups running Highway 93 on weekends, sometimes stopping at the gas station to the south. She knew that Ruth had a prohibition against the industrial district near the south end of town. Ruth's prohibitions in Wren's experience had proven to be a reliable map to where things of significance were located. She got to her feet, 8 miles to the south end of Kingman by her estimate. Bare feet, cut. She was going to walk anyway. She had covered roughly 400 yards south along the fence line when the sound reached her. Not from the direction of the house, from the south. A sound she had heard once before last night, when it had come up through the earth like something geological, the deep mechanical percussion of motorcycle engines. Not one, not a few. Many running together in a formation large enough that the combined sound was not just audible, but physical, something you felt in the soles of your feet, in the back of your sternum. She stopped and turned to face south. They appeared first as light, a horizontal band of headlights spread across the full width of the highway, the kind of spread that only occurs when a very large number of vehicles are traveling abreast and no longer concerned about whether they are staying in their designated lanes. Then the sound separated into its components dozens of individual engines, distinct, each one its own voice, in a chord that was very large and entirely deliberate. Then the chrome appeared, catching the low morning sun. Then she could see them clearly. 40 motorcycles, perhaps more, filling both lanes of Highway 93 in a formation that had nothing accidental about it. Headlights burning in the morning light like a moving wall of fire. Black leather, white lettering on the back of vests, winged skulls. At the front of the formation, slightly ahead of the line, rode a figure she recognized. Not by his face, she was too far away to see his face, but by his size. By the particular proportions of a man she had last seen moving south through the desert dark, with 2 bullet holes in his side, and a pressure dressing she had built from stolen towels and 1.5 rolls of medical gauze. Beckett Holt was upright on his motorcycle. He was riding. He was pale in the morning light, and she could see, even at this distance, the careful rigidity in the way he was holding himself, the posture of a man managing pain through discipline. But he was there. He was at the front. He was riding toward her. He saw her at approximately the same moment she was certain she was seeing him. She watched him stand briefly on his foot pegs, the instinctive response of a man who needs an extra inch of height to confirm something, and then he was pulling to the highway shoulder, and the bike was stopping, and he was off it before it had fully settled, moving toward the fence line. Wren did not run toward him. She stood on the desert side of the fence and watched him come with the same composure she had maintained through the basement and the hallway, and Briggs' questions and the run across the caliche. She had been holding herself very still for many hours now, and she did not yet know how to stop. He reached the fence, and he was large in the morning light, in a different way than he had been large in the moonlight, more solid, more present, the pallor of his face more visible against the weathering of his features and the white bandaging that showed at the open collar of his shirt. He looked at her. He looked at her feet. He looked at her hands. I lost the medallion, Wren said. Her voice was steady. They took it. There are 3 men at the house. The main one is named Briggs. Something moved through Beckett's expression. Something that had no name she'd encountered yet. Larger and more specific than what she had words for. "We know," he said. His voice was rough but controlled. "We already know about Briggs." "He has the medallion in his jacket pocket," she said. "I'm sorry, I tried to—" "Wren." He said her name the way he had said it in the dark the night before, with the specific, focused weight of someone who knows exactly who they are talking to and intends to be heard. "Stop." She stopped. "Everything you did," he said, "every single thing, was right." She looked at him. She was 8 years old, and she was standing on cut feet in a torn nightgown on the shoulder of a desert highway, and she had not cried once in the 11 hours since she had walked out of the barn toward the sound of the crash, and she did not cry now. But something in the structure of her composure shifted very slightly the way a load-bearing wall shifts when the pressure on one side of it finally decreases. Behind Beckett along the shoulder of the highway, the formation had come to a stop. 40 men on 40 motorcycles, engines at idle, producing a low, sustained rumble that moved through the ground and up through the bones of her feet. The nearest riders were watching her. She looked at their expressions from this distance, and none of them were the expression she knew. None of them were Ruth's expression. Beckett put his hand on the top fence wire and pressed it down, holding it against the tension of the wire, creating a gap. "Come through," he said. Wren looked at the gap. She looked at the highway. She looked at the 40 men on 40 motorcycles and the collective patience in the way they sat, the patience of people who have decided on an outcome and are not leaving until they have it. She stepped through the fence. Beckett released the wire and turned toward the nearest rider, a massive man with a gray beard and a vice president's patch who was already off his bike. "Garrett," Beckett said. "The house. 3 men and a woman named Ruth Perkins." The woman opened the door for them. A pause in which something very final moved through his expression. "Don't leave anyone in there who doesn't belong there." Garrett Whitfield looked at Wren once briefly with the look of a man confirming for himself the reason he rode out here at this hour. Then he put 2 fingers between his teeth and produced a whistle that cut cleanly through the engine noise, and behind him 40 riders moved. Decker Pruitt materialized at Beckett's right shoulder. He was shorter than Beckett by 3 inches and broader across the chest, and he stood with both feet planted and his arms loose, the stance of a man who has not needed to perform a threat in a very long time, because his presence is the threat. He looked at Wren. Wren looked back at him. "You're the one who put the compress on," Decker said. "Yes," Wren said. He nodded once slowly, the nod of a man checking a piece of information against a conclusion he has already reached and finding that they match. "You're going to be all right," he said, not as comfort, as a statement of fact delivered by a man who had decided something and was informing the relevant parties. Wren did not respond to this. She was watching the formation of motorcycles move up the highway toward Ruth Perkins's property, Chrome, catching the morning light, the sound of 40 engines filling the desert air until there was no room in it for anything else. The house, the barn, the basement, and its outside bolt, and its absolute dark, all of it, was a quarter-mile up the road. Between her and it, 40 men who had ridden through what remained of the night. They moved up the highway in a column that the morning light made into something almost mythological, chrome and black leather, in the sustained percussion of engines that had been built for exactly this kind of movement. Wren rode in front of Beckett on his motorcycle, her small hands gripping the tank, her bare feet carefully tucked away from the exhaust. Before they had mounted up, he had taken off his outer flannel shirt and wrapped it around her shoulders, and it covered her to the knees and smelled of engine oil and desert and the particular salt of a man who had been bleeding and sweating and riding through the night. She did not speak, neither did he. The access road appeared and the formation turned onto it in sequence, 40 bikes peeling off the asphalt with the practiced fluidity of people who had ridden together long enough that individual decision-making had become collective reflex. The dust they raised was enormous, a red-brown wall climbing into the still morning air. Ruth Perkins' house materialized through the dust. The black Suburban and the 2 secondary vehicles were still in the yard. This told Wren, watching from her position in front of Beckett, that Briggs had not anticipated anyone arriving from this direction this quickly. He had expected more time to work with. He had miscalculated the relevant variables. What happened in the following minutes, Wren observed with the calm, complete attention she brought to everything she needed to understand. The formation split as it entered the property, half the riders swinging around to cover the back of the house, and the barn half coming in, direct their bikes forming a wall across the yard that eliminated all forward exits. The sound of 40 engines in a confined space was not just loud, it was environmental, filling the air and the ground and the chest cavity simultaneously. Garrett Whitfield went through the front door without knocking. What emerged from the house was not a fight in the cinematic sense. It was the rapid conclusion of an asymmetric situation. One side with overwhelming numbers and the specific focused fury of men who had ridden through the night for a specific reason, the other side with handguns they did not have time to draw. Harlan Briggs and his two associates were walked out of the house by men considerably larger and considerably more motivated than they were, and they were placed on their knees in the dirt of the yard, and they stayed there because the alternative to staying there was not better. Ruth Perkins came out through the front door on her own. She was clutching her housecoat at the throat, and her face was cycling through the expressions she used when situations exceeded her ability to manage them. The mask of indignation, the calculation beneath it and underneath. Both the things she never showed if she could help it, which was simple fear. She looked across the yard and found Wren sitting on Beckett's bike wrapped in a flannel shirt watching her. For a moment, Ruth's expression did something Wren had not seen it do before. It broke open. What was underneath was not guilt. Wren had expected guilt. What she saw instead was the look of a woman recalculating in real time the same expression Ruth always used, but running faster now more desperately because the parameters of the situation had changed in ways she had not anticipated. Ruth Perkins had been recalculating her way through life for 11 years of fostering children she did not particularly like or want, and she was doing it now. And it was not working the way it usually worked. Decker Pruitt walked past Ruth without looking at her and came to where Wren sat on the bike. He looked at her feet. "Someone get the first aid kit from my left saddlebag," he said over his shoulder, not loudly. It was in his hands inside of 15 seconds. "Can you walk?" he asked Wren. "Yes," she said. "You don't need to." He held out his hand. Wren looked at his hand. It was large, scarred across the knuckles, tattooed in the faded blue-black of old ink. She looked at it in the assessing way she looked at most things, and then she took it, and he lifted her off the bike with a matter-of-fact care that was nothing like the performative gentleness of social workers. Not the way you lift a child to be seen being gentle, but the way you move something that needs to be somewhere else, and you are the person who is going to put it there. He carried her to the front steps and sat her down and crouched in front of her, while another man, one she would later learn, had done 2 years of EMT training before finding his way to the charter, cleaned and wrapped her feet with the precise efficiency of someone who has done this in worse conditions than a front porch on a clear morning. Beckett came and stood at her left shoulder. He was breathing carefully, holding his left arm against his bandaged side, but he was upright, and his standing there had a quality she had not experienced from a standing adult in longer than she could clearly remember the quality of someone who is present specifically because you are present and who intends to stay. Across the yard, Whitmore Vance had appeared. He must have come in one of the secondary vehicles because she hadn't seen him ride up. He was in a charcoal suit that was entirely wrong for the terrain and leather shoes that were collecting desert dust with every step. He had a briefcase and a phone that looked expensive. He stood near Briggs for a moment, looking at the 3 kneeling men with the expression of someone reviewing tedious paperwork. And then he turned away and opened his briefcase. Decker stood and turned to face Ruth Perkins, who had stationed herself at the edge of the yard, with her arms still wrapped around herself, waiting to find out what kind of trouble she was in. "Whitmore," Decker said. Vance looked up. "Call it in. All of it." Vance nodded and reached for his phone. Ruth's expression changed. The recalculating mask collapsed, and underneath it was something genuine. The alarm of a woman who has just understood that the men in her yard are not planning to do anything illegal to her. They are planning to do something legal. For Ruth Perkins, who had maintained her operation for 11 years on the comfortable assumption that the systems designed to monitor her were underfunded and undermotivated, and easily manage the legal was the more frightening thing. Wren watched from the front steps as Vance made his calls. She watched the other 5 children emerge from the house in ones and twos, drawn by the noise and the gravity of what was happening, and she watched charter members redirect them to the side yard with a gentleness that surprised her in its consistency. She watched Beckett watching Briggs across the yard with an expression she could not look at directly for very long. She thought about the medallion. "He has it," she said quietly, just for Beckett, "in his jacket pocket." Beckett looked down at her. Then he walked across the yard without hurrying and said something to Garrett Whitfield, who walked to where Briggs was kneeling and reached into the jacket without asking permission and came back with the silver medallion on its chain. He brought it to Wren. She took it. She turned it over and found the inner rim and felt the letter B with her thumbnail, small, precise, still there. She put the chain over her head and tucked the medallion inside the flannel shirt. The police arrived at 8:47. CPS arrived 12 minutes after that. Wren sat on the front steps and watched the official machinery arrive the way she had watched everything else this morning, with total attention and a composure that the CPS caseworker, who eventually sat beside her, would note in her report as unusual for the subject's age. The caseworker's name was Patricia Odom. She was in her 40s with the practiced and genuine gentleness of someone who had done this work long enough to understand that performed gentleness is instantly recognizable and does not help. She sat beside Wren and asked simple questions in a quiet voice, and Wren answered them with the directness she applied to everything. At one point, Patricia Odom looked at Beckett still standing at Wren's shoulder and said in the careful professional voice she used for all things that she would need some time alone with Wren. Beckett looked at Wren. Wren looked at Patricia Odom. "He can stay," she said. Something moved through Patricia Odom's expression that was not professional resistance. It was recalibration. "Okay," she said. The interview took 40 minutes. When it was done, Patricia Odom walked to where Decker Pruitt was standing near the vehicles and spoke with him for several minutes in a voice Wren couldn't hear. She watched Decker's face during the conversation. His expression did not change, which she had come to understand in the past several hours meant the situation was more difficult than it appeared. When Patricia Odom came back, she sat beside Wren again and said the thing that Wren had already begun to understand was coming. "We're going to need to place you in a temporary facility," she said, "while the investigation into this household is completed." "I know that's not what you want to hear." Wren looked across the yard at Beckett. He was looking back at her. His expression was controlled, but she had spent enough hours now learning to read his face to see in the set of his jaw, in the way his right hand had tightened at his side, that this was not information he had been expecting. "For how long?" Wren asked. "I can't give you a specific timeline," Patricia Odom said. "These things take the time they take." Wren thought about this. She thought about the system, the holding rooms, the group homes, the places that were safe in the way that waiting rooms are rooms. She thought about the medallion warm against her sternum. She thought about what Beckett had said in the dark. "This is not finished. You understand that. This is a step, not an ending." "All right," she said. Beckett crossed the yard when he saw her expression and crouched down to her level. Not the technique Briggs had used, nothing of the mechanism, just a large man making himself small so he could talk to her without her having to tilt her head back. "This is not finished," he said. "You hear me?" "I know," Wren said. "I'm going to find out where they put you, and I'm going to come. Every week. You're going to see me." She looked at him. "You might not be able to," she said, not as a challenge, as information she thought he should have. "Watch me," he said. She almost smiled. Not quite. It was the structural beginning of one, the face making a shape it didn't complete, but enough that he saw it, and something in his expression that had been very tightly held came slightly loose. The CPS vehicle arrived at 9:30. One of the charter members, she didn't know which one, had gone into the house and gathered her belongings into the paper bag: the clothes, the broken comb, the first aid manual. The encyclopedia page with the circulatory diagram was in there too, folded carefully. She held the bag on her lap as the vehicle pulled out of the yard. She did not look back. She had learned that looking back was not a useful practice. The past was already the past. The question was always what came next. What she did not know as the vehicle turned south onto Highway 93 and Kingman opened up ahead of her was that behind her, Decker Pruitt was already talking to Whitmore Vance in the low, specific tone he used when a decision had been made, and he was now issuing the specifications for carrying it out. And Whitmore Vance had his briefcase open on the hood of his car and his phone in his hand and was already writing things down. The 6 months that followed were the longest of Wren Calloway's life. Not the hardest. She had had harder months. But the longest in the way that time stretches when you are waiting for something specific, when you are measuring the distance between where you are and somewhere you need to be, and the distance is not closing as fast as you need it to. The temporary facility was a group home on a residential street in Kingman. Clean, adequately heated, staffed by people who were not cruel and were not warm, who maintained a careful professional distance that was the institutional version of safety. Wren occupied a lower bunk in a room shared with 3 other girls. She read everything the facility's small library contained in order. She kept to herself. She kept the medallion beneath her shirt at all times and told no one about it. Beckett Holt came on Saturday mornings, the first Saturday she had not been certain he would. She had sat on the bench in the facility's front room and watched the window and told herself in the specific way she told herself things she needed to believe that she would not be disappointed if he didn't come. Expectation was the mechanism of disappointment. She had learned to keep her expectations low enough that the distance between them and reality was survivable. At 9:45, a motorcycle pulled to the curb outside. She recognized the engine before she saw the bike, the specific note of Beckett's custom Harley, which she had committed to memory on the night of October 14th, along with everything else that had happened that night. He came every Saturday. He came in the rain, which happened twice in November. He came the Saturday after Thanksgiving with a paper bag from a diner on Beale Street that had a slice of cherry pie in it, and he sat across from her at the facility's visiting table and set the bag between them and didn't make anything of it, which was exactly right. He sat across from her and they talked, or they didn't talk sometimes. The silence between them was the more honest medium, and at the end of each visit, he stood and looked at her with an expression she was cataloging through enough iterations to begin to understand. It was not grief exactly, and it was not fury exactly. It was the expression of a man who has committed to something and is measuring each time he sees it the distance between where he is and where he intends to arrive. "Suit's working on it," he said every Saturday without exception, and every Saturday she nodded. Whitmore Vance was working on it. What he was working on was by any conventional standard of legal practice not workable. The state of Arizona's family court system did not look favorably upon placement petitions filed by the presidents of outlaw motorcycle clubs, and this was not an unreasonable institutional position on the surface. Vance did not argue the surface. He worked below the surface where the actual structures were, the verifiable facts, the documented record, the things that could be shown in a courtroom and not disputed. He documented everything. He audited everything. He built across 6 months of work a case file that was less a legal argument than a geological survey, layer upon layer of verified, cross-referenced, unimpeachable fact, each piece of evidence supported by the next. The whole thing constructed to make the conclusion feel not argued, but inevitable. The charter's legitimate business holdings: 3 automotive repair shops, a salvage operation, a commercial trucking company, all licensed, all currently audited, all operating within every applicable local, state, and federal regulation. He had the audits done independently and had independent attorneys review the results. Decker Pruitt's personal financial record clean in a way that would have made a city council member envious. Sandra Pruitt's professional record: 20 years as a licensed occupational therapist, current licensure, not a single disciplinary notation. Their home: 4 bedrooms, a yard with a tree in it, a neighborhood with a school 2 blocks away, and a park 4 blocks beyond that. He documented Ruth Perkins' record, which the state of Arizona had been catastrophically failing to document for 11 years. 3 prior CPS reports, all 3 closed without action. The financial records that demonstrated in specific dollar terms the gap between the monthly state stipend received per child and the amount demonstrably spent on the children's actual care. Medical records from 2 former placements documenting injuries attributed to falls. He documented what Briggs and his associates had done and the money Ruth had taken from them, which had been found still in her housecoat pocket when the Mojave County Sheriff's deputies had searched her, and the specific sequence of events by which Ruth had led those men to a locked basement door containing an 8-year-old child. Harlan Briggs was in federal custody within 2 weeks of the incident at Ruth Perkins' property. His associates followed within 10 days of that. The federal case against them was built substantially on the evidence Beckett Holt had been transporting, evidence that had, as it turned out, survived the crash in a waterproof case in a locked saddlebag. Ruth Perkins was charged with child endangerment, criminal negligence, and accessory. She took a plea. She received 4 years. The other 5 children from her facility were redistributed through the county system. Most of them went to placements that were, by the available evidence, better than what they were leaving. The charter rallied around the legal effort, the way they rallied around anything that mattered, completely without announcement, without any expectation of recognition for it. Charter members attended every preliminary hearing in their own vehicles wearing civilian clothes, which was Vance's instruction, in which they followed without complaint. They submitted to background checks. They provided financial records. 2 members with completely clean personal histories submitted to home inspections and produced reference letters from employers and neighbors that Vance reviewed and found genuinely compelling. And still on the morning of the final placement hearing, Whitmore Vance sat at the respondent's table in courtroom 4 of the Mojave County Family Court building with his case file in front of him and a specific knowledge that the judge on the bench, the Honorable Warren T. Clifford, 62 years old, 15 years on the family court bench, had denied 3 prior petitions in cases with considerably simpler, complicating factors than this one. Decker and Sandra Pruitt sat at the table beside him. Sandra had the composed steadiness of a woman who had made her peace with difficult outcomes enough times that the composure was not performed. It was simply what she was. Decker had his hands flat on the table and was looking at the empty judge's bench with the expression he used for significant problems, entirely still processing something. The rest of his face was not advertising. Beckett sat in the gallery directly behind them. His side had healed through the 6 months. There was a thick, pale ridge of scar tissue under his shirt that was still sensitive in cold weather, but healed. He sat with his forearms on his knees and watched the front of the courtroom with the focused patience of a man who has been waiting a long time for a specific thing and is now very close to either getting it or not. Wren sat at a separate table with her court-appointed advocate, Ellen Marsh, who had spent 6 months working with Wren and had arrived privately at the conclusion that Wren Calloway was the most self-possessed child she had encountered in 22 years of family advocacy work. Ellen had prepared Wren for this hearing carefully and thoroughly. She had explained what would happen in what order and what the likely outcomes were. Wren's feet were flat on the floor. Her hands were folded in her lap. Beneath her blouse, the medallion rested against her sternum. The hearing proceeded. Vance presented. He was a very good attorney, and he presented the case in the logical sequence he had spent 6 months constructing. Each piece of evidence introduced in the order that made the next piece of evidence most comprehensible. The whole argument building toward a conclusion that was meant to feel not argued but arrived at. He covered the Pruitts' financial position, their home environment, Sandra's professional credentials, the community relationships documented in the reference letters. He covered the charter's business operations and the independently verified audit results. He covered the specific and documented history between Wren Calloway and the members of the Kingman Charter, the events of October 14, 1998, and every verifiable event in the 6 months that followed, including 42 Saturday morning visits, documented by the facility's sign-in log. Judge Clifford listened with the full attention of a man who had read all the pre-hearing materials and was using the presentation to check his understanding of them, rather than to receive information he didn't have. He asked questions that were specific and showed he had done the work. He was, Vance thought, doing his job properly and well. What Vance had not been able to fully prepare for was the judge's closing statement before ruling. "Counsel," Judge Clifford said, I want to be direct about my remaining concern because I think the parties deserve directness rather than a ruling that appears to come from nowhere. Vance set his pen down. The documentation you've presented is thorough, and I don't challenge its accuracy, the judge said. The petitioner's financial stability is documented and credible. Mrs. Pruitt's professional record is exemplary. The home environment has been independently assessed and found appropriate on every applicable measure. He paused. What I cannot reconcile in good conscience is the institutional context in which this child would be raised. The petitioner is the president of a motorcycle club with a documented organizational history of criminal association. The fact that Mr. Pruitt himself maintains a clean personal record does not fully resolve my concern about the environment that surrounds him. The courtroom was quiet in a way that had its own pressure. Vance had a response to this. He had prepared it carefully, the distinction between organizational history and individual conduct. The case law that supported evaluating the individual petition on individual grounds. The argument he had rehearsed enough times to deliver it from memory without looking at his notes. He did not give it, because at the table to his right the chair moved. Not dramatically, not with the abrupt sound of a sudden decision, with the deliberate quiet care of someone who has decided to do something and is doing it with full awareness of what the action means. Wren Calloway placed her hands flat on the table in front of her and stood up. Ellen Marsh put a hand on her arm. Wren, I'd like to say something, Wren said. She said it to Judge Clifford directly with the gray eyes and the level voice that did not ask for things so much as it presented them. I know I'm supposed to speak through my advocate, but I'd like to speak to you directly if that's permitted. Judge Clifford looked at her. He looked at Ellen Marsh. He looked at Vance. He looked back at Wren. In the interest of ensuring this court has a complete record, he said carefully, I'll hear from you briefly. Please keep your remarks focused. Wren nodded once. She looked at Judge Clifford with the complete attention of a child who had been paying careful attention to important things for her entire life, and who understood with absolute clarity the difference between a moment that mattered and one that did not. On October 14, 1998, she said Beckett Holt came off his motorcycle on Highway 93 at approximately midnight. He had been shot twice. He was losing blood at a rate that, based on what I've read about arterial hemorrhage, would have been fatal within 2 to 3 hours without intervention. The courtroom was very still. I found him, Wren said. I was 8 years old and I was living in a barn because the house I was supposed to live in was a place where I got hurt. I went back and stole medical supplies, and I went out into the desert and I put pressure on his wounds and wrapped them because I had read how to do it in a book. She paused. I didn't do it because I knew him. I'd never seen him before in my life. I did it because he was there and he was hurt, and I knew how to help. She looked at Judge Clifford steadily, the way she looked at everything she needed to understand or needed to be understood. When he was conscious enough to talk, the first thing he asked me was not whether his club was going to find him. It was not whether he was going to survive. The first thing he asked me when he was lying in a ditch with 2 bullet wounds, and I was the one holding the compress, was who had put the bruises on me. She let this sit for a moment in the quiet courtroom. He had been shot twice and he was lying in the dirt bleeding in the desert, and his first thought was whether someone was hurting a child he had never met. In the gallery, Beckett Holt was motionless. I have been in the foster system for 3 years, Wren continued. Her voice did not waver. I've had 4 placements. I've met a lot of adults whose job was to be responsible for me. And I want to tell you what the difference is, not between good people and bad people, because I think most of the adults I've had were trying to do the right thing. The difference is this: every adult who was officially responsible for me was responsible to the system first. They did what the system required and they stopped there. The people in this courtroom who are asking to be responsible for me have spent 6 months doing things no system required them to do. They submitted to every background check and every home inspection and every financial audit, and they showed up for every hearing, and they did all of it in their own cars instead of on their motorcycles, so that it would be easier for people to take them seriously. She paused. And every Saturday morning for 26 weeks without being required to, Without anyone asking him to, Beckett Holt rode to the facility on Beale Street and sat across a table from me for an hour. She looked at the judge without looking away. "I understand that what they are makes you uncertain," she said. "I understand that. I'm not asking you to stop being uncertain. I'm asking you to consider what they've done alongside what they are. Because in my experience, those are not always the same information. And what these people have done every single time they've had a choice is show up." She sat down. The silence in courtroom 4 lasted long enough to have a shape. Judge Clifford looked at Wren for a moment. He looked down at the papers in front of him. He picked up his pen and held it without writing anything and set it down. He looked at Vance, then at the Pruitts, then back at Wren, who was sitting with her hands folded on the table and her eyes level and her feet flat on the floor. "You may take your seat, Miss Calloway," he said. "I'm already seated," Wren said. Something happened to the judge's expression that was not a professional expression. It was very brief and it was human. Ellen Marsh beside Wren pressed her lips together. Judge Clifford reviewed the documents in front of him for 4 minutes. The only sounds in the courtroom were the ventilation system, and very faintly through the exterior wall, the ordinary sounds of Kingman going about a Thursday morning. Then he picked up his pen. "I find that the petitioners have demonstrated sufficient financial stability, appropriate housing, and genuine and documented commitment to the well-being of the minor in question," he said. "I further find that the concerns regarding organizational affiliation, while not without merit in the abstract, are outweighed in this specific case by the individual conduct record of the petitioners, the specific and documented nature of the relationship between the petitioners and the minor, and by the minor's own clearly expressed preferences, which this court is obligated to take into account." He looked up from the papers. "The petition for emergency foster placement is granted. This court will schedule a placement review in 6 months, at which time the question of permanent adoption will be considered." He signed the document. The sound that came from behind Wren was not the sound she might have expected from a gallery full of men who were accustomed to expressing significant things at significant volume. It was quieter than that. It was the collective exhale of 40 people releasing something they had been holding for 6 months, a sound like a long wave arriving at a shore and settling finally into the shape of the land. Sandra Pruitt pressed her hand flat on the table and closed her eyes for a moment. Decker put his hand over hers without looking at her. Still looking straight ahead, with the expression of a man who has arrived at the place he intended to arrive, and is taking a moment to confirm that he is actually there. Whitmore Vance made a note. His pen moved with the efficiency of a man who understands that the paperwork and the emotion are both real and both require attention, and has long since made peace with attending to both. Wren turned around. Beckett Holt was standing in the gallery. He had stood up at some point during the proceedings. She wasn't sure exactly when, and he was looking at her with the expression she had now seen through enough variations to understand completely. It was not grief. It was not fury. It was not the compressed tangle of both that she had seen on his face in the desert dark 11 months ago. It was something that had settled, something that had found its right place after a long time of not being in the right place, and was simply there now. She looked at him. She put her hand flat against her sternum where the medallion was. He nodded once. Slowly, she nodded back. Outside the courthouse on the steps, Beckett was there before her. He was standing in the November sunlight with his hands in his jacket pockets, and he looked at her when she came out, and he didn't say anything for a moment. "You came every Saturday," Wren said. "I said I would." "People say things," she said. "They don't always mean them the same way." He looked at her for a moment. "I know," he said. "That's why I showed up instead of just saying it again." Sandra Pruitt came through the courthouse doors behind them and looked at Wren. Really looked at her in the specific way Sandra had, that felt like being seen rather than assessed, and then took off the light jacket she was wearing over her blouse and settled it around Wren's shoulders. "You were cold," she said simply. Wren looked down at the jacket. She thought about how Sandra had noticed she was cold before she had noticed she was cold herself. She thought about how few adults had ever done anything like that, had ever been watching her carefully enough to see something she needed before she knew she needed it. She did not say anything about this. She pulled the jacket a little tighter. "Let's go home," Sandra said. The years that followed had the quality that good years have, not the absence of difficulty, because there was difficulty, but the presence of something solid underneath the difficulty, something that held when weight was put on it. The house on the north side of Kingman was a real house. It had a room that was Wren's room with a door she could close and a window that looked north toward the Hualapai Mountains. Sandra Pruitt was a real adult, the first one perhaps that Wren had encountered, who seemed genuinely interested in what Wren thought about things, who asked her questions because she wanted to know the answers rather than to assess whether the answers were appropriate. Decker was present in the specific way of a man who shows up to things, to dinners, to school events, to the recurrent small occasions of a child's life that do not seem important in themselves, but are cumulatively the texture of being known. He did not perform involvement. He was simply there in the way that a load-bearing wall is simply there, not announcing itself, holding things up. The adoption was finalized 22 months after the initial placement. The paperwork went through on a Tuesday in August, and the celebration was the kind that the Kingman Charter held for things that mattered, not restrained and not simple, but entirely genuine and entirely itself. Wren Calloway became Wren Calloway Pruitt on a Tuesday in August, and she kept Calloway because it was hers, and she had decided that it was going to stay hers. She kept the medallion. She wore it every day under every shirt against her skin, the silver worn gradually smoother with each passing year, the winged skull on the face losing its sharpest edges, the carved B on the inner rim growing shallower, but never in all the years disappearing entirely. She grew up in the particular way of children who have survived difficult things and arrived on the other side of them into something solid, not without the marks of what came before. Not as though the barn and the basement and the desert dark hadn't happened, but not defined by those things either. She was precise with language. She was good at understanding systems, biological, mechanical, legal, social, and what happened inside them when something failed and what you did to address the failure. She read everything she could find. She was good at chemistry. She was, her teacher said, with varying degrees of puzzlement and admiration, unusually calm in situations that made other people agitated. At 14, she sat at the kitchen table one evening and asked Decker what it had been like when Vance told him the first hearing had gone against them. Decker looked up from his coffee. He considered the question with the seriousness he gave all serious questions. "Like finding out the road you planned to take was closed," he said. "You find another road." "Were there a lot of closed roads?" "Some," he said. "Suit found the ones that were open." She thought about this. "Were you ever afraid it wasn't going to work?" Decker looked at her for a moment. "No," he said. "There was never a version of it where I was going to stop." She went to the University of Arizona at 18 and came back to Kingman on school breaks and on some weekends, and the house on the north side of town remained the house she came back to, and Sandra still had opinions about whether she was eating enough, and Decker still attended things he told himself he didn't need to attend. At 17, she had told Beckett she was thinking about medicine. He had been working on a carburetor in the garage of the Charter's main automotive shop, sleeves rolled to the elbow, greased to the knuckles, and he had listened to her say it with the same quality of attention he brought to everything she told him. And when she finished, he looked at her for a moment and then looked back at the carburetor. "Makes sense," he said. "It makes sense to you," she said. "You're not surprised." He set down his tool and looked at her steadily. The scar on his right side, she had seen it once when he'd been working in the heat. Without his shirt was a thick, pale ridge roughly 3 inches long, the permanent record of something that had happened on a highway in the dark when she was 8 years old and he was 43. He was older now, heavier in the face, more gray in the beard and the hair. He still rode every day when the weather allowed. "You were 8 years old," he said, "in the middle of the desert, in the dark. You read a book and you remembered what you read, and you used it to keep a man alive who would have been dead before morning without you." He paused. "I didn't think it was strange then either. I thought it was what you were." He picked up his tool. "Medicine makes sense." On the October morning of her 18th birthday, Beckett took her to get her motorcycle license. They rode out to the DM Vive on his bike, and she passed the written test and then the riding test, and when they left the DMV, she was licensed, and the desert was very bright in the late morning light. And on the way back, he pulled over on Highway 93 at a section of fence line 3/4 of a mile north of where Ruth Perkins's house had once stood. The house had been torn down 2 years after Ruth's conviction. The lot was empty now, the land reverting to desert creosote, moving back in caliche, reclaiming the cleared area, the desert doing what it always did when human structures stopped resisting it. They sat on their bikes on the highway shoulder and looked at the desert. The Hualapai Mountains were very clear against the sky. The creosote was dry and gray-green. The caliche was white in the sun. The fence posts were weathered the wood-bleached silver from a decade of desert exposure. "Right about there," Beckett said, gesturing with his chin toward a section of fence post roughly 40 yards north of where they'd stopped. "Give or take." Wren looked at the spot. She thought about the night, the specific quality of the dark, the cold that came off the desert floor, the sound of an engine pushed past the limits of what its frame was built for, the way the blood had looked black in the moonlight, the weight of his hand on her wrist, and the way she had not flinched. She reached into the collar of her jacket and lifted the medallion out. She looked at it in the October morning light, the face of it, the winged skull worn smooth over 10 years of daily contact with her skin, the charter design still recognizable but softened. She turned it and found the inner rim and held it where the sunlight hit it directly and looked at the B shallow. Now barely a suggestion of the mark it had been. The silver eroded down to almost nothing by a decade of friction and weather and time. Almost nothing. But there, she put the chain back over her neck. "You know what I thought about," she said in the basement that morning. Beckett looked at her. "I thought about the circulatory diagram," she said. "The one I'd torn out of the encyclopedia. I kept going back through it in my head the whole time I was sitting there in the dark trying to figure out whether I'd gotten the compress positioned correctly, whether the pressure was where it needed to be." He was quiet for a moment. "Had you?" "Yes," she said. "I had." He looked at the fence line. He looked at the desert floor and the creosote and the empty lot where the house had been and the fence post that had been there 10 years ago when his bike had hit the one 40 yards north and all of this had started. He had the expression she had known for 10 years now, through all of its versions and iterations. The expression that had started as something compressed and unresolvable on the night in the desert dark, and had become through a decade of Saturday mornings and school events and shared silences and long rides on this highway. Something else entirely. Something that had found the place where it belonged and settled there. The way things settle when they have been a long time finding their right position and are finally in it. "Let's ride," he said. They pulled out onto Highway 93 heading south into the Kingman morning. The engines of 2 bikes filled the desert air with sound, a sound that traveled out across the caliche and the creosote and the dry washes and the empty lots and the fence posts weathered silver by the Arizona sun. A sound that went as far as sound goes before the desert absorbs it. The sun was fully up, turning the Mojave gold and deep amber, and the road ahead was straight and clear and long in both directions, the way desert roads are. The medallion rested against Wren Calloway Pruitt's sternum, where it had rested every day for 10 years. The silver warm from her skin, the letter B, worn down to nearly nothing on the inner rim. Present in the way that things are present when they have been there long enough that their presence is no longer an event, but simply a fact. One of the fixed coordinates of a life like a mountain. You have always been able to see from where you live. Or the particular sound of an engine you would recognize anywhere in any condition, in the dark or the light, close or distant, asleep or awake. She rode south on Highway 93, and the desert opened out on both sides of the road, and the sky above it was very large and entirely clear, and she was exactly where she was supposed to be, and she had been finding her way here for 10 years, and she was here now, and it was enough. It had always been going to be enough. She just hadn't known it yet on the night she walked out of a barn into the dark and found something broken in a ditch, and decided without knowing what it would cost or what it would give back to try to fix it.